So we are in a social statistics class, and we are coming at this from a sociological perspective. And it's important that you understand where I'm coming from as your instructor, as well as how we do analysis in a sociological class. One of the Two of the key concepts in sociology that we need to talk about are structure and agency. We're going to talk about that, but then we're also going to talk a little bit about some philosophical foundations around um, research methods and how that influences our decisions, basically, to do some sort of statistical analysis. So, in sociology, I do want to talk a little bit about what we are as a field of study. So, I talked a little bit about this, but I want to go into more detail. And the idea of sociology is that we are a systematic study of human society and social interaction. Sociologists apply theories as well as research methods to analyze society and social behaviors. So essentially, what we're looking at is the interaction between individuals and groups, as well as larger society, specifically as it relates to things like our larger systems and structures, which I'll get into what structure is, as well as the kind of norms, values, and you know different transmission of beliefs, how people interact, and how individuals and groups interact again with that larger society. When it says we're a systematic study, what that means is that yes, we are using theories and we are trying to explain social phenomenon, but oftentimes those are influenced by research methods. Those are influenced by some sort of exploration of behavior and interaction through a research methods approach, through a methods based approach. And when we say we're a social science, we are a social science because, again, we're looking at the social world. We blend together history, we look at modern events, we can analyze economics, we can analyze the environment, we can analyze a wide range of different things in our society. I think sometimes it gets confused with psychology, which is a social and behavioral science itself. But oftentimes, psychology is looking at more of the individual processes, right? How you are, processing things on an individual level in your own mind, within your small groups. And while we can look at why people behave a certain way or how they process things, we're looking at it from a larger kind of structural perspective, a larger system wide things. We're looking at larger society. So while an individual may make a particular choice, and we recognize that as sociologists, we're looking at what social factors are playing a role in that. We also look at what's called institutions. I will go into that a little bit more detail with what exactly institutions are, but they generally are kind of patterned spaces, not physical spaces, but like things that are patterned that guide our everyday lives. So things like religion, schools, marriage, family, government, politics, education, those are all examples of institutions, right? We are constantly interacting with these institutions. We've created these institutions, and they guide much of our daily lives and interactions as human beings. So, again, we're looking at these human interactions between people, the relationships between groups and institutions and systems. And I mentioned it being informed by research methods, but it's also because it's informed by the scientific method. The scientific method has been refined over like history, and has its roots in philosophical, ponderings of the world. The scientific method is where we develop a question or a topic, right? You figure out what is it that you want to know, what do you want to find out, what is it you're curious about. You create a hypothesis, so that's an assumption, right? Normally it is an informed assumption, so informed by something that's been completed before. You collect data, so you observe things. In like fourth grade, for instance, they might do something where the observable data basically at this point is what happens when you pour baking soda and we put baking soda and vinegar together. Data then would be their observations of what happens. So you're collecting data, then you analyze it. So like what was the thing, what happened, and then you evaluate it to the hypothesis. We are doing that in social sciences. We come up with a question, we create a hypothesis, we do that in quantitative research, we collect the data, then we run an analysis of it, and then we evaluate. So therefore, We are a social science. And again, it is rooted in these kind of philosophical foundations that guide the idea of scientific inquiry. So I'll talk about the philosophical foundations, but I do want to explore specifically the difference between structure and agency. I apologize if on your end, like, I apologize if the captions box is covering this. I will be uploading the slides for you so you have access to those as well. But with structure and agency, these two concepts are really key within sociology. The first is that structure is kind of the larger organization. It's called patterned arrangements in our society. So this has to do with like the relationships and interconnectedness, yes, between individuals, groups, and institutions, but the structure is the larger society essentially. It is governed by policy, laws, rules, and norms, and cultural values, belief systems, things like that, because sometimes they are not formal necessarily, but the structural makeup of our society has to do with patterned arrangements in our society. So, how is our society set up? It essentially is to help our society function as a whole. And an example would be some of the cultural and social norms. So, like raising hands in class, that is a type of social norm, lining up in line in the grocery store. And then there's, more formal types of norms like laws. So, the idea is it's supposed to help us function in some society, like our society function as a whole. Within that structure, you may also hear systems, which is where you hear the phrase systemic, right? So systemic racism. And this idea of systems essentially is all of the different interrelated components that are connected. So like the processes and the interconnections and the relationships between those within the world and how they connect with those patterned arrangements. So the structure has to do more with larger society and the expectations of society. Agency and structure, though, have to be viewed together. And you may have heard the word agency before, because it's the idea is like, oh, you have agency, and we do. But agency, from a sociological perspective, structure and agency need to be considered as very closely interconnected concepts because your agency is impacted by the structure. Agency can either be empowered or disempowered by the structure. So, agency is like an individual or group's ability to make decisions or choices. Um, and it has a lot to do with power and access to resources. It has a lot to do with, again, how is the structure set up? What are the laws and policies in place? And it can impact an individual's experience or ability to make some sort of choice or movement, or it does impact mobility oftentimes. So institutions can play roles as well. So institutions are an odd in between in that they have their own agency as institutions, but again, those are impacted by the structure, and how that works. How are they empowered or disempowered? And then also as individuals, we're navigating those institutional expectations to like marriage, um, government, military, all of those things. So when we're thinking about it sociologically, we have to understand how our agency is interconnected to structure. If the structure does not allow particular groups of people to live in certain neighborhoods, that means that their agency is limited by the structure, right? So, because we know that redlining is a very real historical fact that happened, which was where the government drew red lines around particular neighborhoods and green lines, and those neighborhoods with the red lines around them had to do with the fact that they were populated predominantly by people of color. That meant that their choices in schools and how the schools were going to be funded was limited. The agency or choices to make that, to the ability to make that choice was limited by the structure, how the laws and policies were in place. If the structure does not allow you to learn to read, your agency to make that choice is limited. Now, what happens a lot though is that in sociology, we kind of focus on this like despair and how depressing it is that the structure is limiting or empowering certain groups inequitably and understandably 100%. But it is important to note that just because the structure limits agency does not mean that individuals and groups of people do not have agency or power to make that change. These structures and institutions are human created. And because they're human created, we absolutely can and do oftentimes make the choice and have that agency to radically reinvent things or push things beyond the scope of what they have historically been. This dynamic between structure and agency is also helps explain why certain groups of people in positions of power may negatively impact other groups of people or disempower them intentionally, and why those groups of people who have been disempowered would understandably become frustrated and resist or push against or protest or um, respond and react in a way that wants to change the structure. So if the structure has been created to empower others and keep them in those positions of power, essentially, and disempower others to keep them seemingly powerless, then this is why the dynamic between those two is so important in society, in sociological analysis. It also means that this helps influence our understanding, or should help influence our understanding, that when we talk about certain things like systemic racism, we tend to be limited within the agency component, where we are only focused narrowly on our individual side. So when we talk about systemic racism, that's also oftentimes, or anything like systemic ableism, like all of these things, that's why it's important that we understand that as sociologists, we're not talking about individuals, like you individually in our class, making these choices. We're looking at the structure. We're looking at those in positions of power and the powerful dynamics in our structure. And that's essentially what we're analyzing. That doesn't mean individuals can't make choices to do terrible things and that on an individual level people aren't problematic and aren't upholding these things. They absolutely are. But what we're saying, what I'm saying here is that sociologically what we're doing is we're looking at how the structure impacts and creates and paves the way for some individuals and others within that current structure on an agency level. Okay. So just to kind of quickly go down the idea of institutions, because you may hear institutional or institutions in any other sociology class or higher education or in this class even. Institutions exist within our systems or our structure. The idea is that it's parts of a whole. So our structure or system is the whole, and the institution are parts, right? So the idea is like you have different parts of a car that are all a part of the car that make the car itself is the car, but just because it's a motor or an engine, right? Or it's a gasket or it's a hose doesn't mean that those themselves make up the car. So the institutions are parts of a giant, of a larger system or a larger whole. Um, and how we are socialized oftentimes has a lot to do with our social positions, the institutional impact, and these institutions are created by humans as well. The intention of them is that they're supposed to fulfill some sort of role within our society. They are supposed to serve some sort of organizational function, so a way to organize all the different parts of our society. Because they're supposed to help us make sense of the world, right? Because the world can be wildly confusing. The world can be pretty, chaotic and confusing. And so the idea is that these institutions help us make sense of the world. There is an element of social control, and I don't necessarily mean that negatively, um, because the idea is it's supposed to help us coordinate things, right? It's supposed to help us coordinate the different elements of our lives in the whole. It also does, though, uphold systemic expectations. So a good example would be nonprofit organizations, for good or bad. They exist. They exist because of the structure of the world. So nonprofit organizations exist with the idea of them being charitable in theory and being for community or people, because the structure is not necessarily intentionally designed for that way as a whole. Also, thinking about nonprofit organizations as well, their ability to be engaged in certain activities is limited because of the systemic expectations. So again, some additional examples of institutions would include family, education, military, government, religion, right? The family unit. So that doesn't mean your individual family, but the idea of the family, of what the family is, that is considered an institution, because there are a lot of interconnectedness between the institution of families, our individual families, and the structure. So, for example, the idea of taxes, right? How we file our taxes is determined by how many people we have in our family. So there's all of these different interconnections together. Okay, so when it comes to research, because we are in a social statistics class, we're not running deep statistical analyses in a way that would be considered like quantitative research. But it does provide us the foundation to understand a quantitative research approach. And I'll get into those a little bit more, but essentially philosophical foundations really are the key to understanding, why we would conduct research the way that we would. We have two kind of main philosophical branches that I'm going to talk about. There's far more than this, but for the sake of our class, just kind of foundationally, I want to talk about these. There's one called ontology, and then the other is epistemology, and they work a lot very closely together when we're thinking about research. Ontology is essentially the philosophical foundation of asking, what do you believe in? Like, what is it you believe about the world? How do you see the world, and what do you believe about it? I like to say that there's kind of this idea that, do you believe in the singular truth, or a truth with a big T, or do you believe that there are multiple truths that can exist together? This does not mean multiple truths, for instance, does not mean that there are not historical or very real socio-political truths, like very real current facts is what I mean. Like there are actual facts that have happened. That's not what this is saying, that there is no fact. What this is asking is basically, do we understand that there may be multiple things going on, or do we believe that there's like one singular truth out there? In terms of research and the philosophical foundations, what this is asking is like, do you want to see the various things that can contribute to this, or do you really just want to find out one thing or one outcome? If you're trying to do the singular truth with a big T, the one single outcome, it's a singular focus. That philosophical belief is positivism. If you believe that there are multiple truths out there, right, that there are deeper explorations and deeper meanings, that's called constructivism. Whether or not your ontological belief, right, your ontological philosophy, so again, this idea of ontology, of what you believe, if your ontological belief is positivism or constructivism, that will determine what type of research method you go down. That's because of this idea of epistemology. Epistemology now kind of goes off of this idea of ontology. Ontology is asking, what do you believe about it? Epistemology is, how do you learn that? How do you learn more about what you believe? And this, again, really is the underpinnings of the research method itself. Because it's asking us how we learn what we know and believe, it's connected to positivism or constructivism. Epistemologically, now these are big words and I understand that, but I just want you to know where they come from. Epistemologically, within the field of epistemology, if your belief is a positivist ontology, that tends to be more of a quantitative approach. If your belief is more of a constructivist approach, that ends up being a qualitative research approach. These are important because the types of research questions that we ask determine which types of research method we use. Now, we're in a stats class, so we're only going to be dealing with this idea of quantitative approach, this quantitative reasoning, statistical analysis. But being able to differentiate between them is key when we're thinking about research, because this qualitative approach, which is more meaning making, absolutely is data. But again, for statistics, we're looking at it from a numerical standpoint. So quantitative and qualitative, the quantitative and qualitative are the two primary research method approaches. Quantitative has to do more with collecting and analyzing numerical data. This is where we would get our statistical analysis. You're going to describe things statistically. You're looking for patterns and relationships, predictions, and hypotheses. So you are creating an actual hypothesis. You're making some sort of prediction. You're doing some sort of predictive inferential statistical analysis, like linear regressions, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And the goal of it is to be generalizable. So essentially what that means is that the goal of that data is something that you could use that data and apply it to another demographic similar. The intention is that generalizability to make assumptions about other demographics. The idea is you take a sample to make explanations about more. This oftentimes is seen through surveys and outside secondary data sets. So you take a survey that's like multiple choice or numerical in answer and numerical in nature. It creates data sets. Qualitative research, on the other hand, is not numerical. It is looking for larger meaning making, but more in how things are created, the symbolism of it, how we make sense of the world. We're looking at the social phenomenon more from a lived experience perspective. So this is why interviews and observations, you can do like visual analysis. You can watch a bunch of movies, for instance, and you're looking at what messages are we receiving? Um, how are social phenomenon explained this way? Qualitative is looking for like the detailed and rich meanings of human beings, the kind of the storytelling aspect of data from human beings. And this is why, focus groups, for instance, are a lot of like communications and marketing folks will use qualitative research through focus groups because we're looking for, the larger meanings behind things, while quantitative is looking at, you know, numerical analysis. And this is why quantitative is related to positivism and qualitative is related to constructivism, because this is how things are created, how things are socially constructed. There are different beliefs and patterns and truths out there, while quantitative is looking for really one or two singular outcomes out there with the data. Okay, so the last thought I want to leave you with this particular lecture is this idea of a sociological imagination. Once you're done watching this, you're going to follow the instructions, and then I'll go into a little bit more detail. The sociological imagination is a concept coined by C. Wright Mills in 1959. And just foundationally, he talks about it being a matter of private troubles or personal troubles versus social problems. Our private troubles are more individual circumstances, which those are very real. So things like maybe you have some sort of marital strain, you're having issues with finances at home, you're facing joblessness. The Wright Mills recognizes that yes, it is absolutely an individual issue, but it may also be part of a larger social problem. So if it's something like joblessness, yes, it impacts the individual, but it may also be a larger issue because it's impacting the community. So how is it applied in a larger context? The sociological imagination allows us to, he says basically, it's where neither the life of an individual nor the history of a society can be understood without understanding both. And this idea of like it's where history meets biography, being able to find out how our individual selves are connected to the larger history and social conditions of the world is really important when we think about now analyzing the world around us and analyzing issues in our society. It's not enough to just think about only our individual struggle. Don't get me wrong, I'm not dismissing that, right? You absolutely deserve to be heard and articulate that, but then going beyond and realizing that perhaps this is a larger structural issue too. On an individual agency level, yes, it's a problem, but what is the structural conditions as well? So your next steps then will be to follow the instructions and go from there.